Hello, welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. One topic that has come up, not too often, but certainly its theme has, is the issue of death itself. Death is an ever-constant companion in life, always looking over our shoulder. We feel that cold, icy touch come upon us, and sometimes it makes our hair stand on end. But when this occurs, there is, of course, that natural need to find closure amongst ourselves. And as we do so, there are different ways in which we can achieve this particular process. Now, the death rituals themselves have changed dramatically over the 1,000+ years that we've at least considered it. And even as we go into prehistoric times, we go ahead and consider all the things that have passed that seemingly seem obsolete, but sometimes still pops up here and there, even in the modern era. And so to discuss death itself and how we deal with it, even in the past, we bring back guest once again, Lynn Garvey-Hodge, who is dressed appropriately for the topic. And well, welcome back to a rather macabre subject, to say the least.
Wonderful. It's good to be here. Thank you, Andrew.
Oh, you're welcome. And so I'm going to have to start with the dress.
Yes.
They always say every woman has a black dress. Mm-hmm. You did a little black dress. This is more different.
Yes.
What exactly are you wearing?
Well, thank you for asking. Back in the Victorian era, which would have been from the 1860s on, the rituals around mourning were very sophisticated and very detailed. In 1861, in December of that year, Queen Victoria lost her husband Albert, and that put her into a period of mourning that she never really quite ended until she herself passed some 40 years ago. All the rituals she tended to practice and encouraged her court to practice became rituals that we in the United States took on as well. And with the advent of the Civil War and the constant reality of death around, as you just described, there was a need to find some meaningful ways to make a statement in society that someone had lost a loved one. As you know, there were well over 650,000 men lost during the Civil War. So brothers, cousins, sons, husbands, fathers, uncles, someone always on both sides, North and South, was succumbing to that reality of mourning and grief. So today I am wearing what would be third stage or light or half mourning. The tradition for a woman would be that she would mourn for 2.5 years. And that first year of mourning would be fresh or full mourning. She would wear all black, veiled. And at that time they called it weeping weeds and veils. And the reason for that was the black fabric that the women wore was not a terribly sturdy fabric. It was made of a black kind of crepe, and it fell apart and looked actually quite unattractive after a while. So with that and the veils, that's where that phrase came from. But by second year, then that was turned into second or ordinary mourning, and women would start to wear more jewelry, get out in the public just a little bit more, not so much into wearing the veils and the black. And throughout all of that, though they did tend to wear a kind of black jewelry called jet. Today I have on an Austrian crystal pair of earrings, which would have been appropriate for back then. And then I would have been, as I am dressed right now, what would have been called light or half mourning, that last half years, that last 6 months of mourning. And the lady I like to say I am here is Mrs. Anna Gilbert McAnally, and I'll tie that back in a little bit later on if we get a chance to talk about the plaque that I have included in our pictures today from the Battle of Sangster Station out in Clifton that happened on December 17th, 1863. So that light or half mourning would have been allowing a bit more of the gray, perhaps even lavender, more jewelry, a nicer transition into normal street clothing. So.
Now, you've mentioned jewelry quite a bit already, and so I see the earrings, and then I noticed the brooch that you have on as well. And I've seen that style of brooch before, but I don't really know too much about it. Is the brooch that's on your shirt part of the mourning process, or is that just something additional added on?
Well, in this particular set of period attire, this is a cameo, and it would be a cameo from my Aunt Elizabeth, who has passed. So because I am in mourning, I'm honoring the fact that she was a special person in my life too. Now, there were also other kinds of brooches, and I'm happy you brought that up. Often there were very fancy brooches that were made out of human hair. So often before a soldier would go off to war in the Civil War, he would leave his betrothed or his wife a significant lock of his hair. And so the custom became to take that hair and weave it into very intricate little brooches, sometimes even bracelets, sometimes rings, sometimes even earrings, most commonly a brooch. And so that would have been a form of mourning jewelry. Another form of mourning jewelry, I know the photographs that we have here come from the Birmingham, Alabama Art Museum collection, were eyes. People often had a small piece of jewelry painted with the eyes of their loved one. And so they would wear that to make a statement. And it went both male and both female. And so that was sort of a very special kind of way of honoring somebody that you loved dearly.
Now, why the eyes? Is it just the fact that they could see you, or you could see them? I mean,
that's a good question. Often the eyes are referred to as the window to the soul. So even if somebody had passed, you would still have an access, if you will, to the window of the soul. There's one other piece I did want to tell you about, and that is a Victorian tear catcher. And you'll see a picture of that here. It is a very common small glass vial that particularly women would literally catch their tears in. And it comes from Psalm 56 from the Bible. A lot of focus on biblical reality was part of that time and place. And that psalm says, "You keep track of all my sorrows. You have collected all my tears in your bottle. You have recorded each one in your book." So that would be a reference to the book of life. And in some of the cemetery iconography that we will talk about, you'll see often an open book, which would reflect the book of life.
Interesting. Never really thought about somebody collecting tears. I gotta ask, just because it's such a unique object, do any of these tear bottles, and I'm hoping I'm saying that one correctly, do they still exist, or are they actually displayed as museum pieces, or have they been more or less lost to time but remembered by tradition and diaries and things along those lines?
No, they actually do exist. If you go into a very high-end antique jewelry shop, that specializes in antique jewelry from the 19th century, you can find them. Many of them are very expensive, and there's enough of them around that if you were a collector and just beginning a collection, it might be something worth making your initial investment on. So.
Would never have thought tears would be worth money, but
yes.
Well, it goes to show you what you don't expect to see.
Yes.
Now, since you talk about the remembrance, the brooch that's upon you, that's certainly a symbol there. Now, is the actual person of the image of the person on there, that is a likeness of the person?
Yes, okay. That would have been the case.
Okay, now with the likeness put there, obviously, that doesn't mean everyone's going to be buying brooches, getting the same one over and over and over again.
Right.
So the best way to, of course, remember somebody would be through their own tomb.
Absolutely.
And with the tombstone or tabletop or even a mausoleum or sarcophagus or anything. Why was it that images became such an important role in creating the tombstone, or just like the final resting place to mark your grave? Why did that become important?
Well, it became an opportunity to tell the story of somebody's life and how important they were. And as you know, out of character as Lynn Garvey Hodge. I am one of the founding members of the Fairfax County Cemetery Preservation Association, and we find so many of these symbols in the preservation work that we do around the county. You know, there's over 450 cemeteries in this county, and we have a tremendous set of leaders in Ruth and Don Williams and Mary Lipsey and Diana Taylor, and Dale Dooley, that are very dedicated to making sure that the cemeteries in this county are identified and surveyed and kept tidy and clean. Well, it is an incredible task. And it's also, though, helpful to know, as work is being done in these cemeteries, what these symbols mean. So back to the Book of Life. Let's talk about a few. One of my favorite cemeteries, and the one that really sort of launched the Fairfax County Cemetery Preservation Association, was the John Marshall Cemetery in Burke. So one of my very favorite pieces of iconography is that of an urn, a draped urn. That is part of that cemetery memorial today. It is made out of marble, and an urn would indicate, it would reflect the soul of the person. Often in cemetery iconography, you'll see an urn, though, that is draped, a draped urn. And that means that the soul is no longer with us. It indeed has departed. Some other examples of cemetery iconography, and particularly in Fairfax County, the Masons were a very, very strong presence at the beginning of the 20th century and the late 19th century. So you see a lot of Masonic symbolism, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Another symbol is that of an anchor. An anchor was often sort of a veiled reference to a cross during the time when Christians were being persecuted many, many years ago. And now it is a sign on a tombstone of someone who's been a very steadfast, committed Christian, somebody who literally was an anchor in somebody else's life. We also see calla lilies. Calla lilies are very simple and very beautiful, and they too represent beauty, and sometimes are used to also represent marriage. I mentioned the Masons. Another order, a fraternal organization, was the Independent Order of Odd Fellows. And one of their groups that began in 1851 included the women, the daughters of Rebecca. So you'll also see a D and an R together, often with perhaps ivy entwined on it, and ivy is a sign of friendship. So if you find somebody's cemetery marker or tombstone that has ivy on it, that is a real indication that they were probably friends to many and loved by many.
Now, you mentioned the Masons, and let's face it, thanks to National Treasure, thanks to Da Vinci Code, thanks to everybody in Mainstream Mania, everyone who's watching says, oh, she said Masons. Okay, let's get back to this Masons. Let's rewind a little bit. So to go ahead and solve the interest of those that look for every conspiracy theory in the Masons, let's just go ahead and give them a few moments now of our time so that they can go ahead and feel very happy.
Okay.
Mason symbolism on a tombstone. We all know, the compass and the ruler, and with Washington, there's the G in the middle. But that's kind of an obvious one. What else is there that's used for the Masons?
Well, let me also point out, between the Masons and the Independent Order of Odd Fellows, Andrew, it's important to take a look at the fact that during a time of incredible chaos and poverty, back as far as the 1700s, 1600s, there came to be a need to look out for those less fortunate than ourselves. Certainly that is a biblical commandment, but also what was going on at that time, and even prior to that, were the building of temples. I mean, the Bible talks to us about the building of Solomon's temple, what all was involved there. So some very skilled artisans had to come together, and come together with a sense of allegiance and a sense of order and a sense of commitment. And so we find in medieval Italy, for instance, the guilds. The guilds were a tremendously powerful force in that particular culture, and that carried all the way forward to the time when this country was founded. Certainly the Masons were abundant in England, and you've already mentioned George Washington having been a Mason. Many of our founding fathers were Masons, and ironically also in my personal world, my father was a Mason, my as in Lynn, and I personally was a Rainbow Girl, which would have been the young teenage daughter version of the Masonic Order. Those young women would have grown up to be Eastern Stars. So the Masons have been with us for a very long time. A very wonderful tombstone iconography that we've got included in our collection here today shows the compass and shows the straight edge, the angle as we've seen here. And that is the Masonic emblem of faith and reason, faith and reason. And what we will also see in this particular tombstone that has the compass on it is a number of other symbols. There's the sun. There you'll see a sun up in the left-hand corner of this tombstone, which means the soul seeking sunshine, seeking the heavens, getting ready to move to the heavens. You'll also see on the right-hand side 7 stars and a crescent moon, which is a reflection of the heavens and a look to the afterlife. Another piece I wanted to speak to on this particular tombstone of a Mason, there are a whole host of different symbolisms here, and I'll just focus on a few more. One is the fact that there are Corinthian columns flanking this particular design, and a Corinthian column had at the top acanthus leaves, and those we see on a whole host of examples of Greek architecture. Certainly we see them in the city here in Washington, D.C., since the city was so remembered by our founding fathers as a place that was to reflect the democracy of a place like Greece or Rome. So we've got the acanthus leaves at the top of those columns. And then we also have on the right-hand side underneath the stars and the moon, you'll see a ladder. That would have been symbolism of, or symbolic of, a couple of different things. One, very clear that this Mason had moved through the different rankings, the different stations within the Masonic organization, as well as, just like Jacob, it was his ladder onto heaven. So I'm very fond of this one because there's so many wonderful, wonderful examples of symbolism in it.
You can never go wrong with symbolism. Now, another one that you had mentioned earlier is how in the way you were dressed as a widow from Clifton, and obviously there's going to be a story involved with her, and I would assume, since we're talking about symbolism and tombstones, there might even be a symbol in there.
Yes.
And so what is her unique tale?
Well, it has to do with the Battle of Sangster Station, which happened on the 17th of December in 1863. It was a very cold and rainy, bleak evening. 65 Union soldiers were taken on by 700 Confederate cavalry. And if you could imagine, they held them off. It was a very dreadful battle. It was later referred to as one hot little fight. Tommy Rosser from the Confederate side was the officer in charge of the Confederates, and John McAnally from the New York 155th group that was stationed there in Clifton took on the Virginia Laurel Brigade underneath Tommy Rosser. And it was a fight that was well remembered on both sides, probably not as well known outside of Fairfax County. And back in 1904, John McAnally wanted to do something to really honor the reunification of the North and South in this country, Andrew. And so he wrote a letter on July 4th, interestingly enough, on that year, to the Board of Supervisors here in Fairfax County to see if a monument could be erected in order to acknowledge those that had passed in that particular little fight, and there were some casualties, some prisoners of war, and that kind of thing. So right now, today, at the Fairfax Railroad Museum, there are 4 remaining plaques of that monument. That monument was taken down in the 1960s for fear of vandalization, and kept in private homes until very recently. And there's one side of the monument that I really like. The inscription says, "Tears in love for the blue, tears in love for the gray." And so this really was a statement. There's two clasped hands. You often see two clasped hands in Victorian cemetery iconography, and there we have it right there on that particular monument. You'll see next to that also a picture of a young woman, and this is not involved with the Sangster Station battle. You'll see a monument of a young woman standing next to a broken column. A broken column would have indicated a life had been cut short. So, and a life had just been ended. One other piece of iconography I wanted to go back and mention from our earlier description of the John Marshall monument in Burke are upturned torches. Torches that are facing downward, which would have meant the extinguishing of life. So if you look at that monument today, you would still see that.
Interesting. I mean, and so, yeah, there's a lot of symbolism you don't think about.
Correct.
And looking at these, but then of course, you get the occasional symbolism that people see, and it kind of automatically assumes you know what it means.
Right.
But sometimes it doesn't. Like for instance, if you saw a person with the skull and crossbones on their grave, does that automatically indicate that they're a pirate, even if it says they died in 1940?
Well, probably not. And quite frankly, Andrew, we saw a lot of skull and crossbones before the Victorian age. That was not an uncommon motif to find in a cemetery. And so what Queen Victoria really kind of did was raise the level of consciousness and sophistication and education around the loss of a loved one, and to honor what their life had been. So you really don't see so much of that anymore. I'll tell you about a couple of other pieces of iconography. One is the oak tree or an oak branch. That would have represented somebody who had likely lived a long time. The oak is sturdy, it's strong. It was believed to have been the kind of wood that Christ's cross would have possibly been made out of. And it's just a real statement of strength and perhaps even leadership. So you will find that often on a monument. You'll also see lilies, which would be a sign of purity. And sometimes you'll even see a picture of a rose that, if it's a bud, it was probably a person that passed that was young. If it was more in full bloom, probably a woman in her 20s. And then if the stem on it is broken, it's an indication that the person died out of cycle, not during a time that would have been a natural time for loss. Interesting.
And so, in looking at all this through all the Fairfax preservation and going through all these different cemeteries, you said there's 450 different cemeteries here, at least in Fairfax County alone. And so, a peculiar question, but that's what we do. In looking at all of these, what would you say, as morbid as it may sound, is your favorite of all the tombstone designs?
Well, I don't know that I have a favorite. I'm enchanted by all of them because each is a story of a personal life. And in a number of these slides, I have Fairfax City Cemetery covered. I have I have the Clifton Cemetery covered, which used to be the Payne Cemetery. I have Germantown covered. One of my, though, very kind of fun recent favorites belongs to a woman named Fay Louise Glacken. And her tomb is very, very significant in the sense that it is unlike really any other I've ever seen. She was a #1 Redskin fan for the year in the year 2001. Sadly, we lost her in 2002. She had completely outfitted her home with all kinds of Redskin paraphernalia. The doorbell even rang hail to the Redskins. And she worked for many years at Sears Roebuck and turned into the most ardent Redskin fan available. And certainly her tomb with the Redskin insignia on it and made of red granite is certainly reflective of her passion in that regard. But you asked of some other favorites. I also am enchanted in the Clifton Cemetery. There are many little monuments with baby lambs, and those are a sign that a child would have passed whenever you see that. Either that or sometimes a small empty chair would indicate. Sometimes also an angel with a broken wing. you'll see that over at Ivy Hill Cemetery, which I've not included in my collection today. There is a wonderful child's monument there that has a broken wing, and the angel just kind of sitting there forlorn.
And it's amazing to think about all the symbolism and messages that go around with it. And so, one of the things that's important to understand, of course, is that, as I had said in the beginning, death is that constant companion, always with you. But this topic in and of itself is not exactly what we would call an easy one, to say the least. But it isn't something that we want everyone to feel like a downer going out. And so, what would you say, just to kind of help to say that death isn't like the finality of everything itself? How would you describe that?
Well, let me share with you a poem that I think is a beautiful summary of some of what we've talked about here. And of course, there's so much on the internet you can read about cemetery iconography. I've just really kind of touched the surface and tried to keep it focused on Fairfax County. But I find this poem that dates from that period. It's called "He is Not Dead." I cannot say, and I will not say, that he is dead. He is just away. With a cheery smile and a wave of the hand, he has wandered into an unknown land and left us dreaming how very fair it needs must be, since he lingers there. And you, oh you who the wildest yearn for an old-time step and the glad return, think of him faring on as dear, and the love of there as the love of here. Think of him still as the same, I say. He is not dead, he is just away.
Well, that certainly will go ahead and sum up a great deal of what we've been talking about here today. And so we want to go ahead and thank Lynn Garvey Hodge for coming back out and
My
joining
pleasure.
us and discussing this rather interesting topic, to say the least. To learn more about cemetery iconography, you can go ahead and check out our website at www.timetravel21.com or email us at timetravel21@yahoo.com. Lynn, thank you so much for joining us. And so,
My
as
pleasure.
always, we'd love to give you a small little parting gift, certainly one near and dear to your heart, the historic cemeteries of Northern Virginia.
Oh, wonderful.
You might find some old friends and new acquaintances, so to speak,
This
in
is
your
exciting.
research. And
Thank
so
you.
this has been Virginia Time Travel, your portal to Commonwealth's past, present, and future, saying that things don't always have to be known as the end. It could just be a to be continued.